Welcome to the Grow Podcast. I'm Pastor Mike with New Hope Network. We're here to help you take your next step in your relationship with Jesus. I'm so glad you're with us today.
What's up, New Hope family? Welcome back to the Grow Podcast. This is episode 29. My name is David. I'm excited that you're here, and I've got Pastor Mike with me as always.
Hello, really
Pastor
excited
Mike.
We're all here?
I'm always excited for the Grow Podcast.
All right. Just checking.
It's usually one of my favorite parts of the week.
Usually.
You know, sometimes I just don't want to talk anymore.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
And so on those days,
you're out of words.
Yeah, I'm out of words.
Gotcha.
I remember, I think it was probably in like my dad's sermon or something. As a little kid, he's preaching on relationships, and he talked about how men have X number of words than women do, and so that's why your husband doesn't want to talk to you.
It's not that he doesn't want to. He doesn't have anything to say.
So if you've ever joined us for the Grow Podcast, and I just sit here the whole time, just know that I was out of words that day, and I apologize. I feel like my chair is really low at the moment.
It kind of is making me feel good.
It's bothering me.
Do we need to start this again?
There we go. There we go. Yeah, welcome to the Grow Pod. No, we're going to keep all that.
All right.
But my chair's better now. For those of you not on the video podcast, don't worry.
The
my
things
chair
we
is okay
don't
now.
edit out on this. You can tell this is live.
Well, we are continuing on with this chunk of the Grow Podcast, following along with our series, Best Year Yet. We've been talking about the different altars. We talked about the altar of promise. Last week we talked about the altar of intimacy. And then this last weekend, you preached on the altar of no return, which sounds very ominous.
Yeah, it sounds ominous, doesn't it?
I like that. It sounds like a Indiana Jones and the altar of no return.
Dun, 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 dun. Okay,
I'd go to that movie.
Yeah. That'd be fun.
Maybe we should sell a
When
script.
we look in the wrong direction, it will keep us from moving forward with God, was the big principle from this weekend.
Yeah, and so let us know a little bit about this one. Where are we coming from the scripture?
From Genesis 18 and 19, because everything we're looking at is over the life of Abraham. And 18 and 19 tell a little bit of the story of when Abram and Lot began to split ways. And Abram generously said, Lot, you choose where you want to go.
Who was Abraham's nephew?
His nephew. Good. Thanks.
That's what I'm here for.
Yeah, that's it. And Lot chose the best land for himself. But there's a key word. He said he chose to live among the plains or among the people of the plains, whereas Abrams chose to live in the land. And it sounds like, it's just a grammatical choice, but I think those words were very specific. Lot chose basically, I want to go live among these people, and Abram said, okay, this is the land given me by God. I'm going to live in it, but the determination for how I live is still going to be God's design and God's leadership, like we've been talking with on the weekends with my little toy here.
You brought your very familiar prop.
God designed things to work a certain way. So, this is a test to see, do you know how?
Oh, boy.
Do you know where the triangle fits, David? That's the question.
Does it fit in the heart?
For those of you that aren't on video, there's the toy of, things fit a certain way. For those that joined us in Williston and Tioga on the weekend of the altar of intimacy, we had kind of a hilarious moment live. But this didn't happen for New Hope here online. But I was playing with one of the shapes. Did you struggle to put the... I was playing with one of the shapes, the heart one. And I was talking about how they have to fit in the right one. And I put it here, and the heart one went through the square one. It just totally blew my whole illustration. It just messed everything up. Yeah, there you go. That's about the speed.
I wish I would have been there for that. I'm kind of disappointed.
It was a moment. It only happened the one time.
I'm sure I never would have brought it up again.
No. I'm surprised others haven't brought it up. But
so again, we're talking about Lot, Sodom and Gomorrah. That's kind of the main story we're going with. So, do you want to give us a little recap of what Sodom and Gomorrah were, what the story is.
So Sodom and Gomorrah, there was a group of cities, and that was 2 of them. Scholars actually believe there were several of them that were part of this story. These were just the 2 biggest ones that were in the plains. And most scholars believe they were kind of near the Dead Sea or a little bit northeast of the Dead Sea area. Hence, the Dead Sea no longer is as fertile as it once was because of the events of Sodom and Gomorrah. And the people of these cities had turned their back on God's design, had invested themselves in incredibly dysfunctional and sinful behavior. And basically, the story is God came to Abram and said, I've had enough. We're going to take care of this, because it's not just that they've chosen to be sinful, but they're influencing everybody else around them.
Yeah.
And invited Abram into this, which is a real interesting thing, and a discussion probably for another time, is when God works, he always invites us to partner with him. He didn't have to, but he wants us to be aware of him working. And it's interesting, he invites Abram into this story. But it's kind of to summarize the whole story, of course, Lot is living among the people and hasn't totally given his lifestyle and his family over them, but has lived among them and doesn't want to offend anybody else around them. So he's living among them. And God, because of Abram, says, I'm going to deliver Lot out of that. And sends angels, delivers Lot out of Sodom and Gomorrah before they're destroyed. For those of you that aren't familiar with the story, you can read it there in Genesis 18, but tells them, don't look back. And of course, Lot's wife looks back, and she turns into a pillar of salt. What sounds like something out of Greek mythology, one of those kinds of moments. And it's like, why would God do that? Why did God do that? Well, again, it goes back to there's a way things work. And the point of the story wasn't so much about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and we could talk about that. The point of the story is, will you trust God's leadership for your life, even when he's asking you to live in a place or to follow a pattern that you don't want to? And I think part of that, like for Lot, it's like, I'm not sure I want to give up. I really liked what I had. And this is that altar, and this is God will take all of us. This is the big point I think I want to really land on in this Grow podcast, is God will take all of us through at least one moment like this, if not multiple moments of this in our growth, in our relationship with him through our life. Is there will be moments where he'll say, will you trust me, even though it means giving up something you don't want to give up?
Yeah.
And the more we look back and say, I really like that, we can't move forward. It's hard to move forward when I'm constantly moving back. We always have a basketball analogy, right? Because I've got a basketball coach
you always
with me.
Throw one out,
and
because of your noted basketball expertise.
and one of these times I'm absolutely going to get it absolutely wrong.
You've done pretty well. You've done pretty well.
But when you're coaching your players to take the ball down the field. Well, there we go. Now I messed that up.
Not a strong start.
Yeah. Down the court. There we go. Down the court. Do you coach them to look where they're going, or are they constantly looking for behind? Now, they need to be aware of their surroundings, but if they're constantly looking behind them, they aren't gonna get where they need to go.
Yes.
They're gonna. I'm thinking of a million ways we could play into this.
Yes.
Help me with this. Help me, coach.
Yeah. So as you're bringing the ball up the floor, you need to have your eyes up so you can see where your teammates are, see where the defense is, see where the ball needs to go.
The coach comes out. Eyes up.
You also, like you said, you need to be aware of your surroundings, because someone might come from behind and take the ball. But yes, you want your eyes up looking forward.
If you're constantly afraid of who's coming, you aren't going to get to where you need to go.
Yep.
And I think, that illustration that broke down very quickly. Stick
to Disney World.
I need to stick to Disney illustrations, evidently. But the whole idea was make sure you look where you're going and don't stay in a place that is comfortable or that out of fear.
If you don't leave the bench and head towards Space Mountain, you'll never go on Space Mountain.
Way to mix these things. So
I wanted to ask you real quick before we go more into that, because I know for a lot of people, Lot's wife's transgression seems a lot more minor than even Lot's. When the men come and demand these young men that are staying with him to know them, and he offers his 2 young virgin daughters up.
I know,
which is like a Father of the Year award for Lot, and yet all his wife does is turn and look back, and she's the one that receives the,
Of course, one of my questions in that is, where was Lot's wife when he's busy offering his daughters up, and then she wants to go back to that?
Yeah.
Basically, when we talk about the sin in the middle of this, Lot's wife was saying, I don't want to give up that life.
Yeah.
I don't want to give up that life and go where God is leading us.
So
that's the point.
Right. It wasn't the sin itself. It was the refusal to move on, to surrender that sin.
And that's where, we talk about a lot with Sodom and Gomorrah, and people say, was Sodom and Gomorrah's sin that much worse than the rest of the pagan world? And this isn't a matter of, sin isn't a matter of degree.
Right.
It's a matter of, am I going to follow God's leadership or not? Because that's ultimately what sin is dismissing God's leadership.
Yeah.
And here is a whole, basically, nation state that has willingly, knowingly, repeatedly said, no, we are going to live the way we are going to live. And if you don't like it, then, we saw what they did with Lot. Mm-hmm. We're going to force our lifestyle onto you. And God just said, there comes a point, and it goes back to God designed things to work a certain way. So when you live outside of God's leadership, you're living outside of his blessing, outside of his protection. And then when you choose to openly rebel against him, you're basically saying, I want to separate myself completely from God's design, so I'm outside of his protection, and I want to separate myself from his leadership, his life. Yeah. So when you separate yourself from his design and his life, what's the result? It's destruction and death. So people are saying, why was he so hard on them? No, this was their choice. There's a way things work. When you separate yourself from life and from protection, the result is destruction and death.
All right, I interrupted you somewhere. I'm sorry, you were about to go somewhere.
No, I mean, there's a lot we could talk with, talk about with this, but I want to help us. The point of the Grow podcast is always to help us with our next steps. Yeah. And one of the things that we see in this, with this one, this altar is all about surrender. All of them are about surrender, but this one really is. Am I going to continue to move forward with God, even though it means giving things up? And here's what we see in Abram's life, but we see anywhere in the Bible where you see a person following God, you see this pattern of God taking them at least once, if not multiple times, where you hit this crossroads. Am I going to move forward with God, even though I like what's behind me, what I'm going to give up? And sometimes it's God saying, I want you to give up something that's actually good. And you're saying, why would he ask me to give up something good? Because that good thing can get in the way of his leadership. We begin to look towards that. In fact, next week we'll talk about in the altar of possession. We'll talk about that a little bit more. But there's kind of this pattern, and I had a friend, Tony Stoltzfus. If I can,
want to try that again?
I always slaughter Tony's last name. His friend, he wrote this amazing book called The Calling Journey that I'd recommend anyone to pick up. But he identified this first for me, and I've delved into a little bit deeper. There is a pattern of God's calling in all of our lives, and you can look at any of us, and I've kind of put it in my own language. But let's look at Abraham. The first, and we see this with the 5 altars in particular. God invites us. We didn't start this, and we choose to respond. Will we respond or not? We see this a little bit later with Joseph. God gives him dreams. Are you going to follow me with these dreams? And what's Joseph do? He goes, he tries to make it happen his own way. So he did it differently than Abram, and it got him in all kinds of hurt. Yep. We wonder how his story would have been different if he'd not been an arrogant, snotty little brat. But he responds. Paul in the New Testament. I mean, God calls him and finally has to interrupt his life in a drastic way. But God invites us. That's the first one, and we get to choose. Are we going to choose to begin with him or not? We may not fully understand what that means even yet. The second, as we look at any step, as we begin to learn relationship. For Abraham, that was the altar of intimacy. That this is about relationship, not a list of things. And some people get stuck here for years because they fall into a pattern of religion, and God's helping us with that relationship. And that's part of what with Paul, we kind of see this. Oh, it's about relationships, it's about following. Paul spent 3.5 years? I just guessed myself. He spent time in the desert. We'll just put it that way. Just learning what relationship is. Joseph had to learn relationship, and he had to learn it the hard way. He learned it in slavery. That. And then as after that relationship, as God, after we learn it's about relationship, we learn to follow God. And these are moments of surrender. So here's a question for you, David. How many times, because when did you first make a decision to ask Jesus to be the forgiver of your sins? Can you remember that moment?
Yeah, I was 4, so I was very young.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember.
You may not remember the moment
existing,
but you knew.
Kind of thing. Yeah, I was with my parents on the couch.
But have there been moments since then? And the answer is yes. But think about this, because I know how God works. Moments since then where God said, "All right, I know you made that decision here, but I'm asking you to surrender."
Right. Yeah, certainly.
Like, what would be? You can choose how.
There's
open you want to be.
No, there's been plenty. I remember, the classic Bible camp in junior high, where I felt that I needed to surrender more of my life. And then in college, as I was kind of going through some depression with dealing with the loss of some friends of mine, and that's that was when I had to almost surrender my parents' faith and make it my own, because I growing up a pastor's kid and went to a Christian school through 7th grade, and then I'm at a Bible college, and this was the first time I had ever dealt with anything like that, where I felt alone, where it was like, okay, I can either rely on God because that's all I have in this, because I felt just so alone and so isolated, or I can just let it go. And so I had to surrender that I thought I could handle this on my own and lean on the faith of those around me, whether my college or my parents. And there's been plenty of moments since then too.
Yeah. So when you think about this,
I probably have more than most people. It's like every 5 minutes I'm like, oh man, here's another one.
This is a pattern, but how it works will be unique to all of us.
Sure.
What those moments of surrender looks like. So if you're taking notes or whatever, think about it. It starts with invitation. Then the next thing he really teaches us is relationship. It's not that some of these don't overlap. But as you begin a relationship, then he's teaching you what it looks like to follow. So you begin to go through these patterns of surrender. He's going to ask you to give up things. And this is where most followers of Jesus get stuck. In the church world, this is where people often get stuck because when they discover relationship or invitation, they want the church to look and feel and act the same way as when they had their most significant spiritual experience.
Yep.
And God will often ask them to give that up, because will you follow me even when it feels different? And there will be multiple points of surrender. And then typically, for most people, there'll be a major surrender moment. Major surrender moment where it's going to be about kind of this from here on. Not that there aren't other surrenders, but for most scholars, theologians call this almost a second act of grace. John Wesley, who's kind of one of the theologians that part of our movement, calls this a sanctification moment. And for a lot of us, there's a major moment.
Yeah.
For you, what major moment, and it's hard to identify for each of us, but it might have been in that time after you lost your friend, and really, there's this major kind of struggling moment. And a lot of people kind of wander before that and come back.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is after that major moment, God's not done with us. And we'll talk about this in the future, but then he teaches us what he's been teaching us all along, but we don't fully get it until after that major surrender. Humility, that it really isn't about me.
Yeah.
He wants me to grow, but this is not about me, it's about him. And even though we think we get it here, we typically don't understand it until after some major moments of surrender. And you see that in Abraham's life. You see that in Joseph's life. You see that in David's life. You see that King David, not this David.
Well, both.
Yeah, both. You see that in Paul's life over and over and over. So, I mean, and here's the thing, I guess, to help us grow. Think about this. When did God invite you to follow him? When did you, so it's invitation, then it's relationship, and then it's beginning to be, he's beginning to work with you. It's surrender. It's leadership. So invitation, relationship, leadership, then what I'm going to call sanctification moment. Not that it hasn't been happening, but there's a major moment. And then this is maturity. And we tend to think as maturity is something we never arrive at. But the Bible says you can and you will arrive at it. But maturity is measured by humility in Scripture. It's not measured by all this to-do list. If you realize, it's not about me, it's about God, it's about other people. So as we think about this in this journey, think about where you're at. Invitation, relationship, leadership, that sanctification moment, or that what I would call that maturity moment. And I think that's a good thing for us to understand and begin to identify where God has us.
And along through that process, God teaches us things, we learn things.
Yeah, I mean, along the way, he'll heal our hurts, because sometimes we get stuck because of something in our past that we don't want to give up, or we need healing of. We learn identity. That's a big thing. Who am I? Yeah. And here I am in my 50s, and I'm still learning some of those things. Yeah. We learn that there are things that we hold out on that are surrender things. Just the other day in my relationship with the Lord, there was something that the Lord brought out, and it's like, I'm still holding on to some resentment towards a person. Yeah. And I hadn't thought of it in a long time, but it's created a barrier inside me. Those are things that are along the way that he'll deal with. But I think there's this pattern for most of us of invitation, relationship, leadership, sanctification, maturity.
Well, thank you, Pastor Mike. And thank all of you for joining us on the Grow Podcast. Again, this series has just been so great, and I've really been enjoying it, not only because I haven't had to edit Christmas movies.
Now that was an incredible series, but you guys
Christmas at the movies was
incredibly
amazing.
hard. Yeah,
and I loved your teaching in those. But this one is just, I don't know, this one's really hit the spot for me, I guess. So, and I think I've heard a lot of that feedback as well. So there's a couple weeks of it left, but if you've missed any of Pastor Mike's messages from this series, I really encourage you to go check those out, either on our YouTube channel, on our website, newhopehere.com, because it's been a really, really powerful series. So, and then we got a couple weeks of it left. So.
So homework for this week is super simple. Just
I like simple homework.
Look at what we talked: invitation, relationship, leadership, sanctification, or maturity. Ask yourself and ask the Lord, where do I think I am right now? What's he dealing with me right now? Because that will help you in your next step. Okay.
All right, let's make sure we do our homework like we talk about on the Grow Podcast. Growth always starts with the next step. So we love that you join us for the Grow Podcast, but it's not just about listening to us talk and Pastor Mike teach for 25 minutes. It's let's make sure we find something valuable, take that next step, so we're continuing to grow in our relationship with the Lord. So thank you again for joining us. If you haven't yet subscribed, make sure you do that so you get notified when the new episodes go up. We would love your feedback as well. So leave a comment or a review, I think, is what you have to do on Apple Podcasts.
Is that what it is?
I don't think you can comment, but you can leave a review. We would love to hear your feedback. And again, thank you for being with us. We'll see you next week.